Hello, everybody, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. For a change, Charlie and I are back at home, which is fantastic. So, as always, I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, and I'm joined by, as almost always, Charlie Araujo from the DX Institute. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I took 1 week off. Come on, what can I tell you? But yes, I'm back to my brick wall in the background here, so it's good to be home.
Yes, you've been flying out to Bangalore, you've been going all over the place. I've been going all over the place. And one of the places that we've been going all over the place to was San Diego last week, where the FinOps Foundation was having their FinOps X show. It was a great collection of 2,000 plus people who are all talking about cloud billing. So cloud billing and expenses, this is my world. I've covered IT expense management for 16 years. And before this, I used to manage expenses and billing over at Bose and at Teradyne. And before that, I used to manage IT billing and telecom billing for a couple of startups. So this is my bread and butter. This is my accidental career. Nobody ever says I wanted to grow up and be an IT and expense guy. I wanted to be an astronaut and rocket scientist and a brain surgeon, but
I
things
started
happen.
wanting to be an actuary, if you believe that. I mean, which is completely 180 degrees from what I should ever do. So, maybe there's somebody out there who says I want to be an IT cloud and expense guy. I don't know.
Maybe the next generation. I don't think that really existed as an option, back in the 80s. But be that as it may, there is now this group of thousands of people who think about cloud billing. And one of the announcements that they made over at that conference was about the focus standard. Oh, I guess they're not calling it a standard quite yet. Technically, it is a specification rather than a standard, but it is a set of characteristics for billing that Amazon, Azure, and Google have all agreed to. And I find that phenomenal because going back to the telecom days, I've been in several organizations that have tried to get AT&T and Verizon and Sprint to agree to any sort of consistent billing standard. I've been in groups that have tried to make software companies agree to some sort of billing standard, and it's never happened before. So I think it's phenomenal that this even exists in the first place, that we've gotten to the point that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google can agree on anything.
Well, I think what is interesting is to me, it demonstrates the amount of pressure that is being brought on the cloud companies to address this issue, right? It was clear at reInvent during the closing keynote. It's been clear pretty much across the spectrum from all the major cloud providers. They're acknowledging the fact that they have to address this issue with the rising cost of cloud, and more specifically about the need for transparency and control around it, which is the entire reason FinOps exists. So kudos to the FinOps Foundation for really driving this forward. But I think it's also a reflection of the fact that there has just been so much pressure to respond to this. But I will tell you, the thing that I'm most excited in reading through the focus specification, whatever they're calling it, is the fact that they have very explicitly left the door open to go beyond just cloud costs. And they're calling it to use by generators of other types of quote unquote cloud-like consumption billing data. So more than just the foundational cloud providers are talking about SaaS and PaaS and maybe just regular software asset management. And I think that is huge, because I've been an advocate of the fact that I love FinOps, but my complaint has always been that it shouldn't just be focused on cloud. And so I'm super excited to see this specification sort of opening that door.
Yes. And we are also seeing that there are massive IT bills that are just outside of the cloud, whether you're talking about something like Datadog for observability or Databricks and Snowflake competing in this AI and data warehousing world, or the other more traditional data warehousing companies like Teradata, for instance, and IBM. They're all still out there as well. And being able to align our cloud bills to some of those other big bills, or some of your other big Salesforce and NetSuite type bills, all that potential is out there. I don't think that focus is ever going to get out all the way to the commoditized SaaS level. There's 60,000 apps out there, and all 60,000 of them are not going to adopt focus. But if you can get the big app companies to align to focus and then have that go along with the cloud players, the big hyperscalers, that would do a lot to make billing a lot
Well,
more consistent.
I have probably greater hope for it than not, because if I look at how much of the spend, if they can go and pick up the major cloud providers and the major SaaS providers, it is not a big stretch to see an enterprise and all the major MSPs and SIs go out there to the world and say, hey, look, this is how we're going to take our billing. And if you don't comply to this specification, we're not going to pay you and we can't sign a contract with you. So I don't think it's a huge stretch to see that this could become this driving standard, because they clearly need to get the major SaaS players, but if they do that, they're going to hit a center of gravity, the sort of tipping point where they're already going to represent a huge chunk of the IT spend, where that's the kind of focus, the impetus behind this becoming. And at the end of the day, it makes sense, because it's just a standard. It's just, here's the tables. They literally talk about in the spec that it's just a set of columns basically that specify this is the data and this is how we're going to report it. It's just like, it's a simple thing, and that's its beauty. And so I'm super excited about this. I think it could really be transformative for enterprise IT leaders that need to get their arms around this. And this is a huge step towards potentially doing that.
Yeah. So that would mean that the next stage is really to see whether the likes of Salesforce, ServiceNow, Workday, NetSuite, and some of the software players who are already hyperscalers, such as Oracle and Microsoft, see if they all play along.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it would be amazing, because this has been one of the banes of my career, honestly, trying to figure out how to manage all of these different types of bills and all of these different standards. I've done so much busy work in my life, just trying to align whether a cust ID is also a customer ID, what kind of prod versus a product versus a sub product, just all these little things that come up when you're trying to align billing information across thousands of vendors.
Well, and I actually think this is part of an ongoing trend that we've talked about before, that we're reaching this sort of a new stage or era of rationalization where we need to start normalizing, because we're certainly the cloud and even AI, we're now getting to this point where the focus is shifting to operationalization. It's not just about blue sky and blue ocean kind of development and figuring it out. It's about how do you actually manage this in production. And so, speaking of Oracle, I think there is this interesting news that you pointed out about Oracle bringing the autonomous database to Azure data centers. And I had to read this twice to really get my head around what this was, because I hadn't heard about this until you shared it. And it's actually really fascinating to me that if I'm, and you maybe you can give the brief on it here, but if I'm understanding this right, Oracle's actually putting its infrastructure in Azure data centers to effectively co-locate an infrastructure platform. And that is, I think, shocking and enlightening on a bunch of different levels, and also indicative of this sort of rationalization process that I'm talking about. So I don't know, what was your take on that?
Yeah, I found it really interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, Oracle and Microsoft have already had a pretty cozy relationship as far as the cloud hyperscalers go, in terms of being able to sync data back and forth. But this actually allows Microsoft Azure hyperscaler customers to be able to run Oracle database on Azure infrastructure. And this also means that Oracle is basically using resources from Microsoft. They have dedicated resources within Microsoft Azure. They also had a previous announcement where they were also announcing Oracle database on Google Cloud. So now you have this interesting setup where Oracle, as a fourth cloud, one that is becoming a major cloud, not quite in the top 3 yet, but definitely exists. Oracle now has dedicated space within other hyperscalers. They aren't really in Amazon yet, but you can see this play where Oracle says, we both have our own dedicated infrastructure, as well as this these dedicated resources in other hyperscalers. And that part is interesting in and of itself. A second part is that Oracle has always talked about the database first and foremost as the starting point for everything. So they are making their database ubiquitous and making sure that their 800-pound gorilla database will, once and forevermore be the core of Oracle, and that you can get it wherever you want.
So what I'm going to say is probably going to sound a little negative towards Oracle and cynical. So I want to preface this by saying I think this is a very smart move by them. But I think what it sort of demonstrates is that their cloud ambitions were probably never truly cloud ambitions in the truest sense. It was always about them remaining relevant and protecting their database play, which has always been their money maker. And I think this sort of solidifies that, right? This is them going to market and saying, yeah, you can effectively run our systems on our cloud, or you can run them in the other major clouds, and we sort of don't care. And I think that's a smart move. I think that, that honestly, it shows a degree of humility around this, that they're probably not going to be one of the major cloud players, and that's not really what their core business is or should be. And I think that's the right move. I also think it speaks, from the opposite side, that I think the major cloud providers don't really look at them as competition in that way. And because of that, they're willing to do this. Now, I would be surprised if they strike this deal with Amazon, mostly because of the vitriol that Ellison has had for Amazon over the years. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see if they strike an Amazon deal as well, then that will, I think, solidify this as far as where their position is. But again, I think it's a smart place, because everyone I've talked to, well, I shouldn't say that. I don't know that I've talked to anybody who is saying we're going Oracle as our primary and only cloud provider. Almost everyone I've talked to, increasingly it's on the list, but it's on that list for these specific use cases, specifically around the database, or maybe if they're using their financial systems or whatever. And so it just, I think it's reflecting the reality of where they're positioning, and I think it's just a really smart move.
Yes, Oracle Cloud, when I see them in inquiries, they come in as a secondary cloud. They have a fantastic cost to performance ratio, at least for right now, which makes them a very good fit for net new projects, but they aren't necessarily seen as the primary cloud. Nobody is pushing all of their stuff over to Oracle Cloud Infrastructure other than in very specific circumstances. But I agree that this database perspective is an interesting one. And of course, going to Microsoft allows them probably to go down market a little bit, because Azure is used more widely, and it's easy to pair that Azure usage with Office 365 or SQL Server or other things that are commonly used.
Well, and I do think, other than, as opposed to Amazon, which has some very directly competitive database offerings, I mean, the reality is that SQL Server, at least in my opinion, has never really been at anywhere near the same scale of robustness that Oracle does. So I think, like I said, I think it's a good move on both parts. It clearly also solidifies sort of Microsoft's approach to being sort of the arbiter for the enterprise, bringing everything together. Again, I think it's a smart move from Microsoft's standpoint as well. So overall, really good. And I will also say, I think probably one of the things that encourages me the most about it is, I think I probably mentioned this before. I used to have this rule when I would do these executive sessions, that there were two words we would not utter, and one was SAP, the other was Oracle, and it's because it would erupt into this session bitching about mostly about contract practices, right?
Yes.
The Oracle mechanism was, we're going to get you in and lock you down. It was like Hotel California. Yeah, you just can't get out, and it was this pain. And so this, I find this again encouraging, that Oracle is recognizing they need to do more to compete than simply try to retain their revenue. We've talked a lot about some of the challenges with the Broadcoms of the world that seem to just try to milk this legacy revenue out of customers. And Oracle's clearly making steps to try to be relevant in this modern era and not just try to lock everyone down. But it's a common challenge, right? It's a common issue that organizations have to try to do that. Which brings us to one of the other, not horribly surprising or interesting, but perhaps shocking and impactful news stories of the week, and that is that the FTC actually took action against Adobe for embracing sort of we'll call the modern iteration of these practices, right, where hiding these cancellations. I personally have suffered through this, being an Adobe subscriber over the years. And not always needing it, so having to cancel. And so I've actually gone through this myself. So I found it quite interesting. So I don't know if you want to kind of cover that one a little bit.
Yeah, so this is pretty straightforward. That it's no secret that Adobe was the first big software company on the business side to move to a subscription model, and they saw massive benefits to their stock price and their revenues and all of that. But also, there was this massive early termination fee that happened if you happen to shut off your Adobe subscription at any point in that first year. So the FTC has looked at this and basically said, over all of that stuff that you've done over the past decade seems to not really agree with what we're trying to do from a better business perspective. We've been getting a lot of customer complaints, and now we're going to see whether those termination fees should have been legal or not, or whether we are going to make you settle for a bunch of money. And obviously, the FTC in the Biden administration has been pretty aggressive, honestly, in trying to set up new rules and trying to create what they would call a more competitive market. Some would call a more restrictive market. Either way, they are quite willing to go after fines and go after large companies and try to set down these rules. So you can definitely see how the FTC could definitely make life a little bit more difficult for Adobe. But this is also interesting because obviously there are other subscription companies other than Adobe. Subscription is the dominant model of apps at this point in time. And it's not hard to see how what affects Adobe could start affecting other companies as well.
Well, what I find interesting about this is that there's really, we talk about SaaS in this broad scope in many cases, but there's really two classes of SaaS. There's the SaaS that goes after the consumer and the small business, and then there's the SaaS like Adobe and Salesforce that go after the large enterprise. And while I think that this idea of an annual contract paid monthly is not common in consumer or small business SaaS plays, those are all about sort of transparency and simplicity. I think it is fairly common in the enterprise play. I think enterprises are pretty used to these sort of annual contracts that are paid with some periodicity and having termination fees. And so I think where Adobe got themselves in trouble is Adobe is this interesting company that sort of plays across this huge spectrum. So, they have, I think the bulk of their revenue, even in the I forgot what they call it, the Creative Cloud, is that what they call it?
Yeah.
Creative Suite. Is mostly large enterprise and design teams. There's still a huge chunk, a long tail of these individual users or small independent designers or whatever. And I think that's probably where they got themselves in trouble, that they didn't sort of segregate those two. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out, and does this affect the likes of Salesforce and ServiceNow and others that may have maybe not the same, and they're going after them for the deceptive practices. And so that'll be the question, right? They're not specifically saying that a termination fee is a problem. What they're saying is hiding it is the problem. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out and the downstream impact, if any, that it has.
Yes. So, and of course, Adobe Photoshop has been a dominant application, really wiping out most of its competition. You can get some open source competitors to Photoshop, but they're honestly not as good. Everybody in this field uses Photoshop. And I think that's part of what makes it so challenging, that they're, from the FTC's perspective, this is probably also a way to start looking at the monopoly-like power that application like Photoshop has.
Yeah, I do think, though, it's also important, and I do think this does extend to the enterprise. I was just, part of what I was doing in Bangalore was working through an entire go-to-market strategy and talking through all the various elements of that. And one of those elements is, in fact, pricing. And part of what we were thinking about, and I was talking about with them, was the fact that even in the enterprise, this idea, we're going all the way back to the cloud billing conversation, every ounce of energy as a CIO or as an enterprise IT leader that I have to spend figuring out a bill or figuring out a contract or figuring out pricing and trying to anticipate what my costs are going to be is time I'm not spending on the things that are actually moving the business forward, that are actually driving innovation or driving transformation within the organization. And so I think we are going to be continually moving towards this era that those organizations that have very simple, very transparent pricing models with as few of the roadblocks to getting out as possible are going to be the ones that win. And it's hard. If you're a software provider, that means it puts all of the pressure on you to continue delivering, right? The only reason a company like Adobe, and I find it ironic because Adobe, to your point, makes phenomenal product. I don't actually understand why they feel the need for this early termination contract, or clause. It's just like, if you're delivering a good product, customers are going to stay. There's stickiness in so many other ways that make it difficult to displace a deeply entrenched product. So there's really very little reason to have that in there if you deliver a good product. And I think, in the end, Adobe's going to look back at this and find it was a misguided approach to begin with. So I think we're in the beginning stages of this, where a lot of companies have extremely complex pricing models, and their bill of materials and their product scope is just incredibly complex and hard to get your head around. And I think we're going to see even large enterprise buyers continually gravitating towards those organizations that can deliver them simple pricing. We've talked a lot in the past about Zoho, and their Zoho One model is the epitome. I mean, they have their controls and caps and whatever, but fundamentally what it boils down to is the average user for the average company of any size is going to go, and I don't remember what the price for Zoho One is, but you pay a fixed price per user and it's all you can eat, and it's simple.
Right.
And it
Less
allows
than
you to
$100 per
expand.
user, and you just go ahead.
And you just go, and those caps are there, but you almost never hit them. And it's like, and I've talked to a number of the executives at their clients, and they eat it up. Literally, they go, "This is fabulous. It allows me to just not think about it." And I think we're going to see that be a driving momentum within enterprise software pricing.
Yeah, I think about a company like Slack, of course, Salesforce company now, but how they've been proactive about basically charging you for exactly what you use. If you cancel in the middle of the month, they will just prorate your bill back to that middle of the month and just say, okay, you left. It is what it is. But your bill is extremely transparent. We're not going to bill you an extra 6 months for anything.
Right.
But I also think this is a big opportunity on the SaaS expense management side. If I were back in my old IT billing job, I would be pretty excited about poring over some of the SaaS companies that have made my life difficult over the past 5 to 10 years, and seeing if they have ETF fees that are seen to be onerous, and then start holding it against them and saying, what are you going to do about this for me? Are you going to make this? Are we going to make this copacetic? And can we get some money back or some sort of discount? Or are we going to push this over to the FTC, who seems pretty aggressive about this and pretty happy to take this to you? I might talk to some of my friends in the enterprise IT space and see if we can get some attention to some of these other application companies that have also made our lives not so happy over the past few years, now that the FTC is going after Adobe.
So speaking of the government taking some action against software companies, there was also news about the Biden administration actually outright banning the sale of Kaspersky. I can never say their name. Kaspersky software. Yeah. So yeah, I thought, this one, I'm not a security guy, but I'm curious what you felt this represented.
Yeah, so I'm not a security guy either, but Kaspersky is a brand name in the security world. It is not a secret that Kaspersky antivirus software is all over the place, as well as other security products that they have. And the Biden administration is basically saying, we are going to ban the sale of this software in the United States, flat out, period. And I think this is part of a trend that we're seeing, because we also saw how the Biden administration is pushing against TikTok, of course, China owned social media network. And this is showing that this is this is an election year. Politics is coming into our software world. And this is a time to start looking at what software companies you're working with, what solutions you're using, and where you might have some inadvertent geopolitical risk at stake, even with solutions that might be air-gapped. They might otherwise be protected from the rest of your resources. You're going to have to start looking at where your sources are, your software is headquartered, as well as where they might have developers. there's a lot of risk going on here, not necessarily for what you perceive to be risk, but things that might get shut down for political reasons. This is going to be a wacky year.
Yeah, and I actually I would argue that I don't know that this is temporary. I think that
Mhm.
we are, I have largely been a world economy kind of person, and I have long believed that that the more we trade and the more open we are, that drives capitalism and democracy and security. But China and Russia in particular have proven that not to be the case. And
Mhm.
so I don't see that this, regardless of who wins our election in the US, I think we're going to see this becoming a persistent issue. Um, and I think it is the right, from a CIO's perspective, I think it is a risk management angle that you need to be looking at this from both standpoints. One is the risk of just having the government take action and leaving you in a difficult spot because you've deployed a piece of software or hardware, for that matter, for like the Huawei stuff, that you now have to deal with, but also from the risk of them being right and you suddenly having this vulnerability, and being an unwitting pawn in some geopolitical mess that you don't want to be a part of. So I do think it's a legitimate issue. I think we're gonna, and I mean, I read the Kaspersky, I can't remember the name, the company's response and saying, we have nothing to do with it. But I think there's ample evidence that both China and Russia are not afraid to yield very hard leverage against what would ostensibly be private companies to subject their will to them. So I think it's a legitimate concern, whether or not the ban is an overreach or not. I think as a CIO, I would be looking very hard at anything. And I think we're going to see the legitimate companies in China and Russia increasingly move to decentralize their operations and establish out of country headquarters to try to
Mhm.
mitigate this. And I think those will be the right moves. So I think we've seen this before, but I think it's a legitimate risk, and I think as a CIO, it's something you need to be looking at very specifically.
Yes, and those vendors that may be providing necessary services, you have to ask them at this point, what are you doing to provide, call it the equivalent of TikTok US, or is there going to be a Kaspersky US arm that is separated from the Russian or Chinese arm? Because
Right.
it's not necessarily about the CEO or the staff's intentions, even, but we just see that there are the governmental abilities to override even the best of intentions from private CEOs, such as seeing what happened to Jack Ma over at Alibaba, where even
Yeah.
that guy, a billionaire riding on top of the world, suddenly disappeared from the world's eye the second that China decided to get a little bit more control. There's nothing that even the richest and most powerful business owners in some of these countries can do about it.
Yeah, no, exactly. So definitely something to be looking at, and I think it's also a reflection of the changing role of the CIO. And not all CIOs, I think, have made this transition. Right, that historically CIOs were very focused on sort of the operational and delivery capabilities, and while clearly that is not only still critical, and I would argue getting every day more complex with the complexity of the tech stack, the CIO has to be operating strategically, has to be looking at this very, very broad perspective, including, the sort of the geopolitical aspects of, forget the security side or the geopolitical risk side, but just where are people making investments? And so there was some interesting news also coming out of Paris about yet another 9-digit seed round for an AI company. And so I guess some people are starting to call Paris the Silicon Valley of Europe. Although, I mean, how many Silicon Valleys of X do we really need? But I thought it was interesting. You raised this up about like, hey, is this a thing? I have some opinions, but I'm curious about yours first as to what you think this represents, if anything.
Yeah, so this Poolside just raised another equivalent of $400 million to support coding based LLMs. We are definitely seeing how large language models are supporting code because we have this structured language that can be quickly optimized. And there's only so many different ways to be able to show functional code that end up going into these models. So these models end up being very good at providing recommendations for basic code. Obviously not for writing entire applications, because the attention span of these models starts dissipating after 50, 100, 200 lines. But for little segments and bits and pieces that people are trying to write, these models can be quite helpful. So now we've got another player in this space, Poolside, which is specifically looking at how to accelerate developer productivity, which is going to end up being one of the big use cases for LLMs. So it's interesting to see that Paris now has 3 big companies in the LLM space between Poolside and H and Mistral that are all dedicated to competing in AI to go along with what we have here in the US.
I think it's interesting. I mean, Poolside aside, I think Poolside has an interesting model. They are ostensibly a foundational or a frontier model, but they are very specifically focused on this idea of copilots for developers. I think that's a smart move. I think that, so from that perspective, I think we're going to see more and more and more of this, right? I've been a huge proponent of the fact that we have enough frontier models. That's not going to be, you're trying to compete. A, you need to have monster funding, and B, it's already saturated. We're going to see consolidation. I think the future, the next round, and we've talked about this before, AI apps, of taking this to the next level of actually applied AI, and how do I start solving specific business problems and use cases with it. I think this is an example of that. It's still extremely broad, which is why I think you're seeing this level of funding, but it's interesting. I think, speaking specifically about the Paris part of this, I think we're going to see this sort of continuing fight of organizations, of countries, and even more than countries, like in the US, cities, recognizing that they need to sort of fight for relevance and to try to become that sort of center of gravity. I was just in Bangalore last week. Bangalore is the Silicon Valley of India, right?
Yeah.
That's not where the big companies are based, it's where the small companies and the startups. And what I think you see with all of this is, despite our remote work world that we now live in, is that there's still something to be said, even if people are working from home, of having this sort of concentration of talent in one place, and having that ability to sort of feed off of one another's ideas, and people jumping around between companies and sort of cross-pollinating. And I've talked about the oh my gosh, I just forgot their name. I just lost the name. Anyway, in Florence, Italy, back at the Renaissance, it was the what is the name of the family?
The Medicis?
Thank you. The Medici effect. It was this book about how the Medicis brought together all these artists, and it just created this cross-pollination. And that's what we see over and over and over again. And so I think in part it's a city or a country saying, we want to attract this investment. And then once that happens, it just starts feeding on itself.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see more of it. And I think it's valid and important. And I think going all the way back to the geopolitical concerns, I think countries are recognizing this is a huge part of the future and they need to have a play in it. So,
yeah, just kind of from a interest perspective, I find it interesting that although Germany obviously has its share of enterprise software professionals from SAP, all of this is centrally focused in France, where business objects started once upon a time, and they have the strong analytics capability, but probably not the same border issues as Germany. Everybody in Europe cares about data privacy, obviously, but Germany's restrictions on data are probably preventing it from being a center for AI in the same way that France is being right now. And I'll be honest, I don't know the exact rules for it, but it is interesting to see that so much of this is happening specifically in France and not in the rest of Western Europe.
Well, a little sidebar on that. So this will segue to our last conversation, but a little sidebar on that. So New York is seeing this, where I live, is seeing this interesting resurgence, specifically in AI startups. And it wasn't very long ago that everyone was sort of writing New York off because it was so expensive and all of that. But I've just read this quote. I don't remember who it was from, but it was one of these startup CEOs, and said the reality is that the best engineers in the world want to live in a place like this, and we're paying them enough they can live here. And I actually suspect that Paris is probably the same. I mean, Paris is my second favorite city in the world. There's a lot of people that love Paris. And so it's
Hmm.
sort of the same idea. And so I think it's going to be this sort of interesting dynamic that it's going to be this, if to attract the talent, you need to have a city that people want to live in. You need to be a place that people want to be. And I think it's going to be this interesting sort of evolution, as this, despite all this talk about remote work and how, the we don't want the return to office and all this stuff. I think there's still this sense that people want to live in certain places, and if you can go to where those people are, then you're going to get the talent you need to build your business. But
Right.
um, speaking of some of the challenges you mentioned about data privacy, or you're talking about some of the challenges, or the differences made between France and Germany, which is kind of interesting because the EU is really driving all that. But that
Mhm.
is curious. I think it speaks to a big challenge that is kind of our last story here, and that is, of course, 2 weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago now. Apple officially introduced what they're calling Apple Intelligence. And one of their big promises is this idea that it's going to be very privacy centric. And one of the few companies, certainly major companies, that is investing very heavily in sort of the privacy angle. Zoho certainly not in the same category as an Apple, but Zoho is also very much going that privacy realm. But for the most part, all the rest of them are maybe a little lip service here and there, but nowhere near. And Apple is making some pretty big claims about the fact that this idea of their AI is going to be running in this quote unquote private cloud, and it's going to be heavily
Mhm.
encrypted. But of course, it's very difficult to do. Unlike many other, so this is an article in Technology Review trying to break down exactly what that means, and is it in fact even possible? Because with AI, unlike say a communications platform, where as the provider of the communication layer, I don't need to know what's in the message. I can literally put a wrap around it, encrypt it, lock it down, and send it. For AI to function, you have to understand what the request is. You have to ingest that data, process it, and how do you
Mhm.
then ensure and manage privacy in that state? And balancing that, because on the other hand, we also have this need for this really intuitive experience. We want it to be open. We want it to have the context. And so I think it's been interesting to sort of watch the evolution of public perception, or maybe it's analyst perception, of Apple's announcements, because I think the world is coming around going, aha, maybe they're onto something, because they
Mhm.
have potentially the ability to simultaneously provide us as individuals, anyway, I'm not sure on the enterprise side, but as individuals, this context, because everything is on my iPhone and they have access to all of that data of what this is. Yet they have the ability to potentially, anyway, control this and lock it down, where they can at least claim to be, much better protectors of my privacy in doing so. Could be a really, really powerful combination. And I'm bringing it up because as an enterprise leader, I think you have to be thinking about how to strike this balance. And as you partner with these various companies providing various forms of AI, you need to be thinking about this and how you're going to manage it. So I was just curious what your, if you saw it similarly, or what do you think the challenges are going to be?
Yeah. So first of all, I applaud Apple on glomming onto the branding of AI with Apple Intelligence.
They're
Having
brilliant.
started Amalgam Insights back in 2017, AI, I totally approve of using that abbreviation in all of your branding. Do it as much as possible. AI, I heard, is a thing. Um, but more seriously, I think this approach that Apple is taking, saying we are going to start by figuring out how to prioritize localized AI, is an interesting one. They want to put as much AI as possible on the device, on the chip, so that it doesn't have to go anywhere, ideally. And right now, the biggest challenge with that is that we have all these foundation models, things that are just too big to run on a device. So I think that's a fundamental challenge, trying to figure out how much of that AI can they actually put back on the local device and make basically part of the OS for the individual user, so that you don't have to worry about even going out to a private cloud, which even Apple has been hacked. So at this point, nobody can guarantee that their cloud cannot be hacked unless it is completely separated from the internet as a whole, which Apple can't do. in providing services. So that device-centric AI, that localized AI, which that challenge we've talked about in other shows, is going to be an interesting one for Apple to take on. And I think it is also an important one for enterprises to think about. You have to figure out how much of that AI that we are talking about right now, how much of that is actually going to end up being on the device or on the computer at the end of the day, and how do you keep that AI information and traffic from being shared with the rest of the world. Apple is taking on that challenge right now. And we're going to see that become an enterprise challenge in more broadly speaking. But there's a lot of nuance here because obviously Apple has also been challenged with delivering on AI in the past. It's not like they haven't had Siri for many years, but honestly, Siri hasn't gotten any better. And I think part of the reason is because Apple has been very loath to connect Siri with the outside world. There's been some connection with Wolfram Alpha, but yeah, they really didn't want it to go off the rails the way that many chatbots have done in the past, such as Microsoft's Tay being one of the unfortunate examples.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Apple is at its core a consumer tech company and not an enterprise tech company. So I look at them, I think they're largely brilliant from both a marketing and how they approach product development perspective. And so I look at them sort of as a model, right? And I always look for examples of how you replicate this. So if I look at this through two lenses, as CIO, I think what they're highlighting are the privacy challenges and the challenge of striking that balance that if you're an enterprise IT leader, you need to be thinking about. You need to be asking yourself whenever you deploy any form of AI, how sensitive is this information that might be being fed into it? Is it being used to train the model? And if it is, that means I may deliver better results and better performance over the long haul, but it means I may open myself to risk. So I need to be thinking about that contextual layer and how it's being added. And I need to then also be thinking about the balancing point between what am I getting for that risk, right? So I think from a CIO's perspective, it sort of helps paint the calculus. And then going back to what you were talking about a second ago, it also means as a CIO, I need to be thinking about how much can I bring down? So do I go the Databricks or Snowflake model where I'm bringing and building on my own LLM, where I'm starting to use small language models to build them and deploy it on my own edge. So I'm doing more and more of this compute inside my own walled garden. So I think these become, to your point, nuanced, complex conversations that as an enterprise IT leader, you need to be thinking about. On the flip side, if I'm looking at this as an enterprise software player, I also need to be thinking about how I'm going to address all those issues for that enterprise IT organization and strike that balance and recognize. I mean, I think that the challenge that I have with, so obviously in the case of Apple, right, they're dealing with very personal information. It is literally my personal device. For most enterprise software companies, especially with a lot of the basic functions we're using some of the Gen AI tools in particular to do, it's not, right? It is a controlled environment. It doesn't require someone providing personal information. And so I think it's about recognizing the differences in all of that and understanding where am I engaging sort of within this life cycle, and how much do I need to be concerned about this, and having realistic and open conversations with your customers about these challenges around balancing privacy and performance. And so I think it's a really good model of how they're approaching it. I actually think that their sort of slow go approach, going back to Apple specifically, is probably going to pay off in the long run because they are thinking about these issues much more than some of the other players are. So I think it's a really good framework to kind of look through.
Yeah, it's been surprising actually to see just how quickly every tech company wants to rush towards AI. And I actually agree with you that I think it's time to cool the jets just a little bit and figure out what to actually do about this rather than simply try to AI wash everything and rush towards the cliff like lemmings.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're already seeing some of it. And I don't want to read too much into the stock market, but like we saw NVIDIA this in the last several days lose $500 billion in value.
Now the biggest company in the world. Yes.
Yeah, but now having this big drawback on stock because there's this whole cooling, and again, the stock market is fickle, so I'm not reading too much into it, but I do think we're just seeing this sort of rationalization period beginning with AI, where people are recognizing there's just too much AI washing. It is fascinating, the trend lines, right? I mean, in the last week, I've probably seen 4 articles suddenly talking about, why is AI development slowing? Have they been overpromising? And there's this sort of media motion about like, oh, this is all becoming too much hype. And I think this is the Gartner hype cycle. It's probably the only thing that they've ever produced that I think is like nailed it, where it just because you see it play out, and I think we're entering the trough of disillusionment on Gen AI, and we'll see where this all sort of lands. But interesting stuff. And as always, as an enterprise IT leader, you get the fun job of trying to sort all this out. So hopefully we've helped a little bit this week, and hopefully we help a little bit each week. But yet another interesting one.
Yeah, it's funny. I would say we didn't have a ton of news this week, but some interesting issues came up this week that are definitely important from a CIO strategy perspective. But with that, it's been another week. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, Charlie, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. And if you're joining us on some of these podcast or social channels, please feel free to like, subscribe, comment. Yes, like. And we'll see you next week.